Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. There's a very little known thing that affects quite a few people, especially as we get to the later years of our lives. It's a particular condition known as bowling ball syndrome. Now, this particular syndrome is characterized by face asymmetry, or TMJ, as it's also known about. This is where the jaw moves to one side, one eyelid is droopy, sinus obstruction, snoring, one shoulder higher than the other, migraine headaches, and other symptoms. Now, if you can imagine that this is something that might affect you, especially as you get up early in the morning and realize, boy, my back is just killing me, you might want to tune in and find out how this can actually be taken care of through the treatment of what is known as Tenet Autonomic Balancing System. We're also going to be known how to stimulate what is known as the Nakatani points that mirror traditional acupuncture meridian points to successfully treat the condition naturally. There's the key. Why revert to medicines to try to alleviate the surface symptoms, such as the pain that we might feel in a backache? Or God forbid, should we ever have to take that next step known as surgery? So we're going to be talking today with someone who is a practicing massage therapist located in Beaverton, Oregon. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Amkara Newhouse. Amkara, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, I'm glad you had me, Daniel. I'm excited to talk about the bowling ball syndrome and also Nakatani points and all those things you're describing. It's quite an amazing thing to find such a common cause to many of our, as you pointed out, we tend to wake up and go, what happened?
I think it's kind of interesting to hear something like bowling ball syndrome, and you take a look at some of the symptoms that I had mentioned and realized, I guess if you bowled long enough, you would probably look like something like that.
Well, possibly, especially since with that long weight on your arm going down, as you roll the ball on the court, what do they call those? Not court. Well, I'm not familiar with bowling, so I've seen it once, but I've never done it. So I'm not especially good at that part of it. It actually goes more to the fact that our head weighs about the same as a bowling ball, and that was described first. This whole syndrome was first described by an osteopathic physician named Robert Boyd from Ireland. And because our head, 8 to 10 pounds, is actually a lot of weight, and to keep that centered over our body, the body compensates a lot with the first two vertebrae, especially just below the head, to keep that centered. And of course, if you have some skull bones offset above that, then you can see how you can have a lot of muscles having to contort to keep that 8 to 10 pounds of bowling ball above the spine where it's supposed to be. And of course, that can overload muscles in other parts of the body and may result in a chronic pain. Does that kind of make a bit of sense?
It absolutely does.
So if you've bumped your head, probably not just on the kitchen sink, but possibly, depending on the angle or something, you could have a bit of that. And so then we see these things build up over time, especially since it's odd how you might have noticed you tend to injure the same place more than once, and that buildup can result in a long-term misalignment of the small bones in the skull, which in turn causes all these muscles to misalign in the neck. And then you see the shoulders, you see the hips, you see all these, one shoulder going forward, and all these things building up. The other part about that is the residual stress tends to convince the brain and part of us that we cannot relax. And that keeps us stuck in our fight and flight mode as opposed to relax and repair mode. And that also tends to wear us down over time and contribute to these conditions. Okay? Can you see where we're going with that?
Absolutely.
So the key in the base of the skull is called the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone looks like a butterfly, and it's kind of behind the eyes, behind the sinuses, and then attaches at the base of the skull into the occiput, which is where these spine goes through that part of the skull and goes down. And there are a lot of large muscles that come forward from that, and you can kind of feel them if you tense your neck and put your fingers right there just above your collarbone. You can feel those big muscles going back into the occiput, which then transfers into the sphenoid. And that's the big key, because in the sphenoid bone is, which means wedge, comes the word for wedge, and it's all the other bones in the skull are focused around it. It's sort of like a big key, and when it's off a little bit, then everybody else has to work around it.
You know, it's interesting to note as you're describing this that a person might say, okay, so you're saying a little bit of head trauma or head injury, if you will, which, you know, we can tend to do that from time to time, would actually go along to affect the alignment of the hips. That seems kind of like worlds away in some ways. How is that possible?
As the body tries to realign with the sphenoid bone going down through, it's going to translate first into the shoulders, and then once it gets those kind of happy and kind of aligned up, it's going to say, okay, now I need to get the hips and scoot those over. And that's just through the fascia layers and the muscles. Then there's other aspect to it, is that the brain and spinal column are covered by the same tube and surrounded by fluid, which links the skull and the sphenoid bone and the sacrum, the base of the spine, in a fluid lock. So anytime you have a kind of a concussion or a force in the head, that pressure wave goes down and transfers the load directly into the hips, even when you had the first shock, the first time you hit your head. Mm-hmm. And then as things continue on, there's this continued hydraulic lock of pressure anytime anything happens in the skull and goes down into the sacrum, which is the base of your whole pelvis and hips.
You wouldn't think that something could be so systemic, but it's just amazing just how, I guess, sensitive the human body, especially the skeletal system, actually is.
Especially since one of our defense mechanisms, I'm not sure if I want to say defense, but repair, is that when we have a stress, the body and fascia layer immediately starts to distribute it everywhere to spread the load out so that if you get hit, somebody hits you in your car, you fall down or something, wherever that impact is, it immediately starts transferring it to other parts of the body to spread that load out so that that impact is minimized. Our mental process also takes that same experience and starts to cut it up and stick it in various parts of our brain, so it's very hard to, you might have talked to people that said, well, I can't quite remember the accident or what happened. And that's also a way the brain tends to deal with the trauma, so that you don't have the whole piece in one place. And it's very hard to put together exactly what happened when you have a deep trauma or some accident happen or fall, or you may not even remember later on. In my own case, I fell down a cliff, and I was saying, yeah, I remember I did something, and my shoulder was dislocated, but I can't remember what happened. And my friend was just, oh, don't you remember? You fell down. It was 25 feet. You were stuck under that rock. It took us 5 hours to get you out. It was like 3 in the morning. We got to the hospital. Oh, yeah. And
wow.
You go, gee, how could you forget that? And it's actually the way we're made to deal with stress, is to move it to other places so that it's not so present, so it's not so immediate, so that we can move ahead in the difficult situation and get out of it. And then hopefully go back and clean up that mess later. And that's where our trouble comes, is we don't always go back in and try to get appropriate and helpful treatments to deal with those old issues. Mm-hmm. And they can be quite buried, and it just is an underlying pain or dullness, or something doesn't quite work right, and we can't quite figure out why. In the case of these small muscles in the skull, it can be a really small little bit of trauma that can be a trigger for a bunch of other pieces. Does that kind of make a bit of sense, how we see these little pieces all over the body? And if you can kind of pull that kingpin out and get it into a nice position, then the same hydraulic couple going down to the sacrum also starts to transmit that fluid pumping action in a smoother fashion, and also tends to signal to relax that particular experience away. Then all of a sudden you see the body align over the whole spinal column better, and all of a sudden the person goes, "Wow, gosh, what happened? I'm up right now. I'm not starting to feel like, gosh, I just feel like I got hit by a truck or something." And it can be years later when these things get triggered from overwork, an emotional stress, or something can bring back, and the body can recreate that experience from a previous period.
So it sounds to me that what happens, especially when you were describing that accident that you had by going down a 25-foot cliff, is that the body has a way of actually storing, apparently, the injury or the trauma in such a way to sort of protect itself until you can later hopefully address that and get it corrected. Is that kind of what you're saying here?
Yes, it's exactly how the body, we have a lot of mechanisms so that we can get ourselves out of immediate danger, sort of pull deep on our reserves, and then, as many people experience, 3 or 4 days later, all of a sudden you go, geez, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but now, look at all this pain, look how I'm incapacitated, what happened? And that's a time to really get some serious treatment. Mm-hmm. The fascia layer has little channels that were discovered by a Korean fellow, I'm going a little off topic here, that have shown to be, they have little fluid channels in them, and his name was Bonghan, and I'm not super good at Korean, so I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. I believe it's Bonghan, but he actually photographed these and showed these, and they're very small. They're actually like in millimeters wide. They're really actually smaller than millimeters, nanometers, about 30 to 50. Anyway, they actually parallel the alignment where the fascia layers come together that would transfer stress, and he showed that they were filled with the same kind of fluid that's inside our joints. That's what has this ability to, through hydrostatic pressure, when if you have, let's say, a hose and you push on it, the water will squirt out the end when you squeeze it. Well, so when you get an impact, that hydrostatic pressure will push through the fascia layer as a shock wave and put stress in other parts of the body through that effect. It also has the ability to create electricity when it's distorted. That's a property called piezoelectric, so it actually creates an electrical wave that also allows another way to transfer energy to other parts of the body, which is quite fascinating to think about, too. Muscles also have that ability to, when they're compressed, they create a little bit of electricity. So there's all these little tiny microcurrents running around the body that sort of can charge the body. When you exercise, that's one of the ways the muscle charges the body, is by being compressed and squeezing your muscles. You feel better, and you're like, oh gosh, I feel more energetic. It's partially because you've generated electricity and cleared up some of those channels. So when you run into something and that shock wave happens, that's how the body moves these stresses around the body.
That's really fascinating when you kind of think about it the way that you're describing is, that you might have a blunt force of some particular type, and it could be fairly light, it sounds like. It doesn't have to be something, like you're being punched by somebody or you get hit by a car, for instance. It could be that you're riding your bicycle. You just happen to fall off your bike in such a way, and at the moment, you may not feel much of anything. You kind of get it, you shake it off just a bit, but with this displacement of, as you were using the analogy of sort of hydraulic fluid, if you will, it says, okay, we got a stress here, but we're going to move it into other areas of the body. In other words, disperse it in a way to create balance so that you're able to cope with that particular stress moment. But if it doesn't get addressed and corrected, then what you're going to find yourself is in some trouble in the next few days, and you're going to wonder, well, wait a minute, I didn't feel all that much pain or that much of a difference then. It kind of hurt for a little bit and went away, but man, now I can barely roll around in bed or even lift up a, cup for having some coffee here. That's pretty amazing.
It it's quite so much of it seems to be the particular angle, the way you fell. There's a lot of different things can happen that just happen to hit a spot where the body can't quite deal with it in a certain way, so you're going to hit a spot that triggers the other muscles to tighten up and pull the head off a little bit. That's one of the biggest places where we find this, and so that's why I keep on referring back to the head. However, I've also seen people have something similar happening around the ankles and feet, because as one of the few animals that walks totally upright, and some people claim the only animal, there's a lot of skill and coordination between our mental processes and that ability to walk upright. So our feet, if they get traumatized in some ways, can have a body-wide effect also. But the more you see it in the skull, so if you have a little bit of a muscle tightness on these little micro spots, the micro alignment of the skull, and that changes the pumping action going up and down, then we all of a sudden see possibly even, also that pumping action is the nutrition. It nutrifies the brain. It's actually how most of the brain does not get fed blood directly. It actually is filtered across that membrane so that viruses and bacteria and everything else that can be in our bloodstream doesn't get to the central nervous system, our command center. And so if that happens in a pulse-like fashion as it comes into the brain, and that pulse and also the circulation of fluid is a little bit hindered, then we can have portions of the brain that are fed a little bit less, which can be come on as a kind of a low-grade headache or a high-grade headache, and also changes in personality because it's triggering it acts like you're experiencing a situation all the time, so that you are always reacting to a situation that doesn't have an external reality, but it seems real to the brain. So you can have a personality change after a really light tap on the head in certain places, and which is everything from childbirth, for example, which is actually more traumatic than it seems for the children, or just simply falling over and bumping your head. And that can, that little blockage, if it's not fixed, can even reduce the IQ of a person. It can make them very, very jumpy and create situations that have an impact on our social life and mental skills. With a little bit of treatment in possibly as little as one, but however, habits came from gestures which and postures. So it typically has once it's magnified itself out to a pattern, it can take a few treatments to have it totally realigned. But even in the first one, we will see some changes in a new direction, and the person will be noticeably calmer, less reactive, clearer, and certainly enjoy their life a lot more. And of course, in terms of deeper ones where it's starting to manifest, shoulder differences, back pain, things like that, we see persons come off the table able to move their heads side to side before when they couldn't. They can go turn maybe a few degrees off to one side, and then their head stops and they can't look back to see the rearview mirror in their car. So all of a sudden they can turn and look over the shoulder and look behind them, and they go, yeah, that's awesome. It's in a practical sense.
Yeah, I was just thinking, too, because you've described some very unique things that our listeners should really become aware of, because, the first thing is that you were also talking about a bioelectric current that flows through our body, and it flows through freely. And that when, we might have a slight impact, for instance, I gave a simple one that you might, fall off of your bike, for instance, or, perhaps you go to walk through a bedroom door and your mind is somewhere else, and so you're not really paying attention to where you're walking. You find yourself walking right into the door or the wall. That can happen. I mean, it really is amazing some of the ways people impact themselves, especially when it comes to their heads. But that causes these little obstructions, it almost seems like micro obstructions that, as you said, when at the time of impact, it displaces in such a way the pressure to other areas until that it can actually go back and be fixed. And then one of the other things you were also talking about, too, was birth. And I was remembering back in the day reading about birthing trauma and how there was an osteopathic physician in Seattle, Washington that used to get newborn babies, because their bones kind of came out in such unusual ways because of coming through the birth canal and whatnot, that he would sort of mold them and work with them like a sponge and get it all corrected in such a way so you can allow this, as you were describing, this bioelectric current to flow. And they were kind of tagging and realizing that through something like, let's just say birthing trauma for this instance, because you talked about babies, is that this is the possibility that because that happens, if it doesn't get corrected, you could see the possible onsets of things such as like ADD and ADHD, And I started thinking, as you were describing other things as well, that if you don't correct this too, then the brain doesn't get that kind of bioelectric flow that you were talking about, and that people might also have things such as, that brain fog where we get up and we just feel this heavy fog, we can't figure it out, and a lot of times it gets eluded to nutrition, perhaps, that can clear that up, and that certainly helps. But is that sometimes that brain fog the cause of something, like maybe a little bit of a trauma that we did and we just kind of put it off because it seemed like no big deal at the time?
There's actually a number of cases where that's true, and in fact some of the other earlier work done by another osteopath was specifically targeted at autistic children, and he saw 20% of them basically return to a normal relationship with the world in just 6 weeks to one person with 6 months. But nevertheless, that 20% is not a small. It's definitely worth trying. Everybody showed a little improvement, but some basically you wouldn't know that they ever had autism or had that extreme sensitivity to the world to where they could not deal with sound. There's many aspects to autism. That's a difficult one, to almost too far of an extreme one to talk about, because of the symptoms are so varied, and I'm not sure that, it's very, very hard to say that this would fix everybody in that.
No, in fact, I didn't even mention autism. I was mentioning something, such as the possibility that, and this was back in my reading of this, is that it possibly might have had a connection to things like ADD and ADHD. I know autism, that's a different animal altogether.
Right,
but yeah, but mostly what I was looking at is the possibility of how we might have, that brain fog that just seems to kind of come on set, or perhaps a little bit of dizziness or nausea, and you're kind of thinking, where's this coming from? And you don't realize it could have been from a light trauma that you had maybe 2 or 3 or 4 days ago, and it just simply needed to be corrected. But because that didn't happen, you didn't get yourself realigned, now you're starting to see how it's beginning to affect, in a systemic way, those other things.
Oh, certainly. In cases like that, that's very, very much the case. It definitely, I worked on a person yesterday with exactly that, as you described it, and they got off the table really just like they said, geez, I feel like I'm ready to go rip up the world. That's how they placed it, which is, that's one of the more successful ones. But nevertheless, it's certainly possible you go from fogginess to clarity. And, of course, that goes back to the cerebral spinal fluid not pumping correctly and stagnating. So you get places in the brain that are not getting nutrified. And that's one of the keys, is when we get that smooth, a little bit of stickiness or stuck muscles in the skull can create enough of a blockage that an area of the brain isn't getting as much fluid flow, doesn't get that fresh nutrients, so you go, oh, geez, why can't that? What's going on? And so you might try something to stimulate the heart, which might help put a little more blood towards the brain, but might not. And it sort of seems like things get speeded, or, as we use in the term of caffeine, then you're speeding up whatever part of the brain is getting some nutrients, goes faster, so it seems like you're more awake, but you still might not have full capacity. by using speeding up the actual conduction. That's how caffeine works. It speeds up the conduction between individual neurons. But if you can't get the caffeine to the neurons, then you don't speed all of them up. You just speed up some of them. So it kind of works and kind of doesn't. You can sort of be like a wide awake, asleep still, partially awake, partially not. So those are the cases, especially where a bit of this treatment in just a few moments can feel like you've opened up, you've gotten a fresh drink of water, more likely more like grape juice or orange juice or something, went straight to the brain, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, your head's clear, you're thinking, and more importantly, there was also an emotional part of it, that you're more relaxed but energized, and that's the part that's quite amazing. When we have these adhesions or knots, there's a tendency for the body to remain in fight or flight response, which also reduces blood flow to the brain and puts more to the outer muscles, because that's dealing with getting you out of a physically challenging situation. The example of a tiger biting you on the backside, or being in a burning building or something, and all of a sudden, yes, you're really, really strong. However, you're more reactive than acting, and then it reduces blood flow both to the internal organs of rest and repair and to the majority of the brain. And so when you need to get into fixing the condition, and you're still stuck in fight or flight, there's less blood going to the brain and to the internal organs to make all the enzymes and nutrients and absorb food to start repair. And that's one of the big challenges, where the little bit of adhered muscle in the skull can be perceived as an external stress stimulus. There's still the tiger's biting you or chasing you or something. And so the body will not go into completely to rest and repair, which keeps your brain foggy, and you feel like you're still stressed, so you're still kind of panicked. And it's sort of a self-perpetuating syndrome, because there's always this stimulus that appears to be external, but it's inside ourselves, keeping us in our reactive fight or flight mode and away from rest and repair.
You know, I can't help but now something also comes to mind, and that is the state of depression. How often have you treated people for, let's say, this bowling ball syndrome we've been talking about here, where you've seen maybe depression, they might have had maybe a mild form of it, who knows, that it actually cleared up just as a result of something like this?
It works, and you're definitely onto it, because the longer you're in fight or flight and your reserves get used up, the body goes into depression as a self-defense to say, okay, you've got to stop, we've got to get some rest some ways. And even though you haven't totally turned on the rest and repair mode, because depression also has this tension to it. So your body's depleted. Your energy is low, but you haven't been able to relax for whatever reason. So there's this tension, and when we remove that tension, then the person goes into rest and repair mode. Energy returns to the tummy. Oftentimes they fall asleep for about 10 to 20 minutes, but it's a very they call it the delicious nap. They come out and think, gosh, wow, I felt like I slept 20 hours or something. And it can only be, I'm actually 10 or 20 minutes would be the longest. Usually it's only about a minute or two, and then they come to, but their breathing changes, and oddly enough, when you relax completely, and the head's not and the neck are not totally aligned, there's a tendency for the tongue to fall back, and you have to mouth breathe a little bit more, which means they tend to snore or actually kind of puff through the mouth. And so you get this kind of exhalation through the mouth that's very unusual. It's not a usual sleeping pattern. It sounds a bit like a steam motor, but and then that clears up, and you see the skull and neck kind of give a little wriggle, and then that goes away right after that, and then they stop. And that's usually about the time they're starting to come out of it, and that's part of the realignment process, which usually happens right after I've used the biomodulator and they're still on the table, and we possibly have moved on to the Nakatani points. I guess we could talk a little bit about the treatment too.
Yeah, we've sort of been talking about that, but then you brought in the biomodulator, and I thought, wow, there's an interesting word there. Tell us what that is and what it does.
Okay, this is based on a couple of different research veins that happen. Part of it's from Yoshio Nakatani, who was one of the first people to measure voltages at the acupressure. Well, points have since were identified as acupressure meridian points. And he developed a technique using a fair amount of voltage, much higher than is currently, but for only for a few seconds. But so it might have been a little intense, let's put it that way. Anyway, I haven't had an opportunity to work with one of his original pieces of equipment. That would have been a tube-developed device back in the 40s. Not something you run into commonly in this day and age. There weren't many around when he was making them. Anyway, so a doctor in Texas who's an ophthalmologist, an MD, a naturopath, and an acupressurist, and he's 75, so he's had time to get all that education and practice, named Jerry Tennant, through his own need, developed this device to apply microcurrents and millivolts of electricity with varying frequencies to the body, and it runs on AA batteries, so you're talking very small amount of electricity, and it does it in a way that is sort of below the level of which the central nervous system of the brain can feel. In fact, that's how you set it, because you want it just, if the person can feel it, you back it off so that they can't, because you're trying to be in the fascia layer in the local nervous system of the area where the muscles are, and you do not want to stimulate the brain, because that will tend to be seen as a stress, and you go more into fight and flight, because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm getting shocked. I need to tense muscles. And we're not trying to do that. We're trying to apply energy that tends to cause relaxation of the muscles, and that happens by simply, all of our muscles are chemical reaction based, and if you add some electrons, that will push the chemical reactions to completion. And once they're completed, then the muscles relax. So this device, that's one of the things it does. It also adds electrons along the meridians, which charges all the other muscles and the organ associated with that meridian. So you can measure voltages and see, okay, there's tension there. The voltage is low. That means, in the case of, for example, the gallbladder, that would tend to mean that the person ate irregularly. The gallbladder has to hold 1.5 quarts of gall per day, waiting, because that's how much the liver makes over the course of a day, waiting for meals to show up. And use about 2.5 cups per meal, which adds up to the about close to 3 anyway. 1/3 of a quart and a half. So you're thinking about 3 cups per meal of this bile goes into the small intestine to help to digest the healthy fats and proteins and things you need. And so if you're not using that, then, and there's still more bile coming from the liver, it can release some of it into the intestinal tract. What it tends to do instead is pull some of the liquid out of it, which means that the bile is getting more concentrated, and concentrated liquids tend to crystallize out the chemicals, because they just don't stay in solution, and so you get a layer of, they call them gallstones, but it's more like gall sand in the mucus layer of the gallbladder, and that of course makes the gallbladder less flexible and irritates it, so it gets inflamed, and we have a gallbladder attack. So again, as we goes along with the whole pattern of stressed lifestyle, we don't eat on time, we don't eat regularly, and when we do in a stressful fashion, and the blood supply doesn't go completely into the stomach and all the organs to help digest food. You get just a little of it, so there's a lot of incomplete biological functions happening that tend to, and then of course what it's doing is creating the raw materials to rebuild our body, and we don't give it the time to do that or enough energy, and so we tend to be using up our reserves and making ourselves out of substandard materials because we didn't absorb everything we need from the food. So all of a sudden we have less building blocks to help create a healthy body. And then, of course, once we've made a less healthy body, then all our organs that we built out of substandard materials don't work as well. So our stamina is lower, our ability to digest food is lower, and it's sort of a self-building principle that we probably age ourselves by not getting ourselves in a state where we are actually relaxed, digesting, and recharging using the body's natural system so that it doesn't absorb the food properly, which means it can't build itself appropriately, so it doesn't work as well. And so it's sort of like getting a car repaired with used parts. And then once those wear down, you don't have enough money to buy another new part because you weren't able to make your business trips to make the money to get better parts, so you get even worse parts, and it keeps on wearing out because the car is never getting, your body's never getting repaired up to that standard. So if we can reverse that trend and get chemical processes to complete, get muscles to relax, and also change the course from fight or flight into rest and digest, then all of a sudden we see very large changes quite quickly in the body. And it's it's quite an amazing thing to see how you can get pain in the body, and people all of a sudden, it can be a little bit embarrassing because all of a sudden your stomach and organs, everybody starts gurgling and growling, and liquids are flowing. And I tell them, okay, this is part of what happens when you rest and digest, and it can happen literally within the first 5 seconds of the treatment. All of a sudden, which for women especially, because we're taught, we don't make noises in public, that's not appropriate for women. Guys are sort of got a little bit off because we almost are expected to burp occasionally in public. That's because guys are slobs. I should put that differently, but there's a bit of that kind of stereotyping that happens, but you don't expect guys to be especially smooth in certain ways, although, of course, that if you've had the unfortunate embarrassment of burping inappropriately in public, it can take a long time to recover. The social implications can be tremendous.
Understood. Yeah, we get the whole lunch scenario that somebody just might seem a little more gurgly than we really like them to be, but you're saying that that's actually a normal process, as long as you get yourself corrected. Now, we talked about there was the one option. Now, there are also natural options that you share with people, such as yoga, Tai Chi, and Qigong, for example. Tell us about that a little bit here and, how these things actually help.
Well, obviously, if you practice much yoga or Tai Chi or these things, you do feel the relaxation, energizing portion of those techniques. And they are incredibly helpful for keeping you at a higher level of general health because that movement, as we said, you're going to be creating electricity with the muscles, you're going to be creating some relaxation. And it is really, as far as I can tell, I think that the human beings are designed to have a little bit of this kind of exercise pretty much daily. This is not easy to pull off. I know I'm giving everybody this high bar. How many people really can put a practice or two of Tai Chi or yoga in their daily practice? Tai Chi can only take as little as 15 minutes, so it's not such a big chunk of time. But if you're working or you've got children, 15 minutes is forever, so it's not easy to get there. However, these techniques do help, and they are tremendous. And they do resolve smaller traumas because that relaxation and then those currents go up into the brain and will help to release those blockages and keep that whole system working correctly. Now, after having said that, there are always the repetitive injuries. Even good yoga practitioners tend to have their mouth too far forward, pulls on the shoulder, strains the trapezius muscle, pulls a bit on the head, and then all of a sudden a little tap or even just that same repetitive thing can transfer all the way up into the skull, and we can get that blockage and see a similar result. So that I work on a lot of people who have found a way to put pretty much a daily practice into their life, not as frequently. They recover faster. They need less treatment, but nevertheless, it seems like I myself, when I had a bigger trauma, needed this approach, and it resolved issues that I've had for in what was a number of years between the time I had my big trauma and I got this treatment, it was like, oh my gosh, I'm 40% stronger now, and I don't know why.
Wow.
My head's clear. I was like, I lost, I don't know, it was just, that's partially how I got so enthusiastic about this, because I saw, whoa, geez, everybody should have this, like quarterly. I think if people have more issues, they could use a few. It's 40 days to make a new habit, so you have to kind of roll that into the equation. Mm-hmm. If you've got a big trauma, one treatment probably isn't going to fix it. You have to think in terms of you had this habit, it's become a posture, it's locked in. Your brain knows where it's in. To back up for a second, the brain knows where it is in space because it knows apparent muscle lengths, and also going back to the sphenoid bone, that part of the brain that sort of tells us where we are in space and knows what level is actually is cupped by the sphenoid bone. So if you have some muscle misalignment and some apparent muscle lengths always being chronically short, and we take those away and your body doesn't know where it is in space, the easiest thing for it to do is put those patterns back in.
Oh.
So that's why it's so helpful to have that yoga and Tai Chi practice after you have a treatment, to use that new range of motion, to use that new strength, and get the central nervous system, your brain, going, oh gosh, that's a new length, but I know where I am now in space. I can propriocept, I can kinesthetically relate. There's a lot of different words that have been developed that talk about that, all of them big and long, but basically it's just that your brain knowing, okay, that's the new muscle length, this is how far because you don't have to look and see how to touch your nose. You know that distance, and that's because the brain has known muscle lengths, and it knows how to touch the nose whether you look at it or not. Well, if you change those muscle lengths and all of a sudden you feel spacey, like I don't know where I am, which is often happens after any kind of body work, people go like, gee. Well, if you don't want your brain to go and say, oh, let's put those old stresses right back in there so I know where I am, you exercise them a bit. You use that new length, and then all of a sudden, oh, yeah, and that will help maintain that as your new baseline. And if you've had the old pattern, like I did for, well, over 10 years, actually, and I had some, once you have an injury, then that area tends to attract more injury because it doesn't work quite right, so you tend to re-injure really easily. And if you can treat those deeper muscles that got injured and get it really gone, then you'll attract fewer, the same situation won't result in an injury. Even though I did physical therapy, I went to a very good orthopedic surgeon to work with my shoulder. By their standards, I was healed. But they don't, maybe more of them do now. At the time, they didn't actually hook on my arm and test muscle strength and really see what muscles were turned on and which ones were turned off, which is, I don't use a gauge because it takes more time. But you can quickly tell simply by resistance testing what muscles are on and off. Actually, I shouldn't say quickly. You have to have training. You have to know where you're going with that.
Right.
Anyway, a good friend of mine, a sports chiropractor, who I went to him and I said, everything is working except this. And he reached out and touched into my armpit, which is right on top of one of the meridians, and says, does that hurt? And I go, gee, yeah. And his approach was simply to pull on it until it goes away. But then I was introduced to the biomodulator, and you simply have that on there for a few minutes, and it's way less painful to a treatment pattern as opposed to like, oh, that hurts. Well, if you pull it this way, yeah, it's going to hurt for about a week while you're doing it, but it will resolve the issue. Because you're going right into that knotted muscle that's trying to preserve your body so you can get out of a stressed situation. Challenge is your body doesn't know that the stress situation is past. It just knows the last time you input it, and it's keeping you safe so you can keep on going no matter what to the best of your ability, but actually go into rest and repair, releasing that and retraining those muscles that were traumatized. Oh, right now, that's not happening. You can let that go. We can go in there and do gradual application of stress after releasing it, so if there is any remaining damage, the body rebuilds along the line of appropriate stress in the directions the muscles go. When you first get traumatized, the body goes in and like throws 2x4s and ropes and anything anywhere to immobilize the damaged area to keep you as healthy as it can and get that area lock down, sort of like creating a cast around it, or just,
right.
Like
as we were discussing earlier, you get that light trauma, and as you said, it finds a way to disperse all that into other areas until it gets addressed. And if it doesn't, then you can find yourself with a whole range of things that you could have never expected, and you got to get that thing flowing again. And that's what your work is quite a bit about here. And I was kind of curious for our listeners out there, as we've got about a minute and a half left here. Where's a website people can get more information about your work?
Okay, that's my first name, Omkara, Aumkara, structural, the word structural, bodywork.com. And I have quite a bit of information on there about meridians, about the biomodular, and about the approach I take. And the goal is most people are born to some degree strong, flexible, pain-free. And if something has happened that you don't have that, well, let's get back to your original operating, the way you were made specs. So it's all in the DNA, it's all there. We can trigger the body into repair mode, and in some cases, I've worked with people who are born with dislocated hips, and we can actually, quote unquote, do better than factory specs because they came off not quite put together correctly. It takes a little more work, but it does have some unbelievably amazing results with people who had chronic hip imbalances or something that they were born with, and you can retrain the body, get those circuits open, and they are way happier and ability. It's quite something.
Yeah, well, all it takes is just getting that body structure back to the best way that it was supposed to be, and you'd be amazed about all the little things that start snapping into place and how much better you feel. Kara, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. Quite a fascinating little journey about how all this, as I was saying earlier in the program, systemically works with itself. And boy, you throw a little something off, and there's just a whole bunch of little things that can really happen that make life kind of unpleasant. We don't want that, do we?
Exactly.
And go ahead and give out that website one more time.
Okay, Omkara Structural Bodywork, and there's a few videos on there about some self-care exercises and a couple examples of the treatment.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us here on the program. I feel better already.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a great time to chat with you, Daniel. Have a great morning.
You too. We want to thank you, the listeners out there as well. You can find out more by also visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We'll have a link up there for you so you can find out more about why you should be sure that your body's structure is right to where it should be, so you can get rid of some of those nasty little things that might be going on with you. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.